The night they handed us the keys, I thought it was a blessing. A year later, I learned it was a contract with my freedom, as the fine print. I still remember the glow from the porch light that evening, soft, golden, trembling, in the spring wind. My husband, David, stood beside me holding the envelope his parents had just given him. Inside was the document that said our mortgage was paid in full. I could hear his mother's voice echoing from the kitchen, all honey and pride. Now you two can finally start your life without worry. I wanted to believe her. I really did. We'd been scraping by for years, late payments, skipped vacations, dinners that ended in accounting instead of laughter. When they offered to help, I was too tired to argue. David's parents were old money, the kind that didn't brag, just assumed control. And I, the daughter of a nurse and a factory worker, still felt like a guest in their family. That night, when we toasted with the cheap champagne I'd picked up from the gas station, I saw something flicker in David's eyes, a mix of relief and guilt. I reached for his hand across the kitchen table and said, "We'll pay them back." Somehow, he squeezed once, too quickly, and looked away. I should have asked what was really written in that agreement. The months that followed were calm. For the first time in years, I slept without counting bills in my head. We repainted the living room, planted rosemary by the window, and talked about adopting a dog. Life felt steady, like we'd finally earned the right to breathe. David's parents visited often, bringing little gifts and unsolicited advice. His mother, Elaine, had a way of saying things that sounded kind until you listened twice. "Well, you've done such a lovely job decorating. I suppose it feels nice having a real home now." Or, I told David he finally made the right choice, marrying someone practical. I laughed it off. I told myself she meant well. Then came the dinner invitations. Every Sunday, we were expected at their house, no matter the weather, no matter our plans. It wasn't a request. It was an unspoken rule. If we missed a week, Elaine would call with a sigh that could flatten your spirit. "Well, we just thought family meant a little more to you too." David always caved first. "Come on, it's just dinner," he'd say. But it never was just dinner. It started small. Elaine would make comments about how I handled the house finances. His father, Robert, would ask if I'd considered returning to something simpler, as though my freelance design work wasn't real employment. Once, over dessert, Elaine leaned forward and said, "You know, if you two ever decide to have children, we'd love to be more involved, maybe even help with the schooling, or where you choose to live." There it was, that word again, help. I smiled politely, but something in me went cold. Later that night, as we drove home, I told David I didn't like how they spoke, how they made everything sound conditional. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "They're just old-fashioned, Anna. They don't mean anything by it." But I knew control. When I saw it, I'd grown up watching my own mother lose her independence to kindness. That came with strings. The first real crack appeared the following spring. I'd been offered a small but promising contract with a marketing firm in Seattle. It was remote at first, but they hinted at a long-term position if I could relocate eventually. When I told David, his face lit up for a second. Then he frowned. "My parents won't like that," he said quietly. I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. A few days later, Elaine called me. "I hear you're thinking of moving," she said, her tone crisp. "You might want to review your agreement before making hasty decisions." That word agreement lodged itself in my chest. "What agreement?" I asked. "Oh, I assumed you'd read it," she said lightly. "It's all standard. We paid off the mortgage in exchange for equity rights. Nothing major, just protection for our investment." My mouth went dry. "You mean you own part of our home?" "Well," she said, "technically, we own all of it until certain conditions are met. You can stay as long as you abide by them." I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That night, I tore through the file cabinet, searching for the documents from last year, the ones David had promised to handle. My hands trembled as I flipped through each page until I found it. A private family trust agreement. I read the words 3 times before they made sense. His parents hadn't gifted us the money. They'd bought our house outright, and we were, in legal terms, permitted residents. I looked up at David, my voice barely steady. "Did you know about this?" He couldn't meet my eyes. "I didn't think it mattered," he whispered. That was the night I stopped calling it our home. For weeks, I lived in quiet fury. I still cooked dinner, watered the rosemary, went through the motions, but every creak in the floorboards reminded me it wasn't mine. I felt like a tenant in a life I'd built with my own hands. Then, one afternoon, A letter arrived. Notice of breach of agreement. Apparently, Elaine and Robert had reason to believe I was planning to sell or vacate the property without consent. They demanded a meeting to discuss terms of continuation. The audacity nearly took my breath away. When we arrived at their house that Sunday, Elaine had tea waiting, peppermint, my least favorite. Robert stood by the window, arms crossed, watching me like a misbehaving child. Elaine smiled. Anna, dear, we just want to make sure everyone's on the same page. We've done so much for you two, and we'd hate to see family ties strained over a misunderstanding. What misunderstanding? I asked. She slid a paper across the table. It was an amendment, granting them full control over any sale, remodel, or relocation decision for the duration of occupancy. I pushed it back toward her. No, her smile didn't falter. Well, she said softly, then I suppose we'll have to take the house back. That was the moment something in me hardened. I'd spent my life being polite, reasonable, quiet, but not anymore. I stood, my voice steady. If you want a war over this house, fine, but don't expect me to play by your rules. Elaine blinked. You wouldn't dare challenge us. I smiled. Watch me. The drive home that evening was silent, the kind of silence that buzzes under your skin, where every thought feels louder than the sound of the engine. David kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight, fingers gripping the steering wheel like it might hold him together. I stared out the window, watching the rain beat against the glass, the reflection of my own face, tired, furious, and suddenly, awake, looked back at me. Finally, I said it. You knew what they were doing. His voice came out small. I didn't think they'd ever what? Use it against us. I snapped. You signed away our house, David, our home, and you didn't even tell me. He turned toward me, guilt spilling from his expression. I just wanted to help us, Anna. We were drowning. I thought it would make things easier. I laughed, but there was no humor left in me. We're tenants in our own lives, David. That's not help, that's control. He didn't say another word for the rest of the drive. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table under the dim light of the pendant lamp. The letter Elaine had given us was spread out in front of me, the ink sharp and final, but something about the language bothered me. I'd worked with enough contracts through my freelance clients to recognize legal fluff when I saw it, and this one had plenty. Buried between paragraphs of trust jargon was a line that read, "This agreement shall be null and void in the event of undue influence, coercion, or misrepresentation." My breath caught. Undue influence. Elaine had insisted that the arrangement was a gift, and David had confirmed it verbally. But if they'd misrepresented it, if they'd used pressure or deceit, that clause could change everything. I needed to see the original mortgage papers, not just the ones they'd handed us. The next morning, I called our old lender. After 20 minutes of hold music and polite refusals, a sympathetic voice finally said, "Ma'am, I can send you a copy of your loan discharge documents. You might find what you're looking for there." 2 days later, a manila envelope arrived. I opened it at the kitchen counter while David was at work. My hands shook as I scanned the paperwork, until I found it. The signature page. David's name was there, but mine wasn't, not even once. I was never listed as a borrower or a conor, which meant, legally, I'd had no say in anything that followed. I sank into the nearest chair, heart pounding in my ears. They hadn't just taken advantage of us, they'd erased me. When David came home that evening, I showed him the papers. "Tell me you didn't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He stared at them, then rubbed the back of his neck. I thought, it would be simpler if they handled it. Something inside me cracked, quiet but irreversible. "Do you even hear yourself?" I said, standing up. "You let them buy our house without me. You let them own us." He tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled back. "Anna, please. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." "No," I said, "I'll fix it." Over the next week, I started documenting everything. The texts, the letters, the contracts. I spoke to a friend of mine, Marisol, who worked for a property attorney. She agreed to look over the paperwork after hours. When she called me back 2 days later, her tone was low, serious. "Anna, this agreement is shady. They structured it like a family loan but registered it under a trust. There's language here that could absolutely be challenged if you can prove coercion." "What do you mean?" "Well," she said, flipping through pages I could hear rustling over the phone. "There's evidence they misled you about what you were signing, and since you were an uninformed spouse and didn't sign anything yourself, you might have grounds to nullify their claim altogether." A pulse of cautious hope ran through me. So, what do I do? Gather proof, she said. Emails, texts, witnesses, anything that shows they presented this as a gift and not a financial agreement. Once we have that, I'll introduce you to someone who can help file a claim. That night, I scrolled through my old messages with Elaine. I found it, a text she'd sent the day before the mortgage was cleared. Don't worry about the paperwork, dear. This is our gift to you both. We're family, no strings attached. I stared at those words for a long time. Gift, no strings attached. If only she knew how powerful those lies would become. When I showed the message to David, he looked horrified. She said that. Yes, I said, my voice steady. And I'm going to use it. He sat down heavily on the couch, running both hands through his hair. Anna, please, don't do this. You'll just make it worse. Worse, I repeated. David, they've already threatened to take our home. I have nothing left to lose but my dignity, and I'm not giving that up. The next week, I met Marisol's contact, a woman named Celia, a real estate attorney who spoke with the calm precision of someone who'd seen too many family battles end in tears. After I explained everything, she nodded slowly. I've handled cases like this before, she said, and let me tell you, it's never about the money. It's about control. Your in-laws likely assumed you wouldn't push back, because most people don't. But if you're ready to fight, you have a case. Her confidence gave me strength. We began drafting a counter notice, asserting that the trust agreement was invalid due to misrepresentation and coercion, and that any further attempt to repossess the property would be treated as an unlawful action. When I left her office that day, I felt lighter than I had in months. But that peace didn't last long. A few days later, I got a message from Elaine. It wasn't angry, it was worse. Anna, I don't know what you think you're doing, but involving outsiders in family business is a grave mistake. You're only making this harder for yourself. I didn't reply. That evening, David came home pale, holding a letter. They've filed for property reclamation, he said quietly. I took it from his hands, my stomach dropping as I read the words. They were serious. They wanted us out, and for the first time in my life, I wanted to see them lose. I closed my laptop that night and whispered to myself, you wanted a fight, Elaine. You've got one. I wasn't just protecting a house anymore. I was protecting my name, my worth, my independence, and I wasn't backing down. The morning the first court notice arrived, I was standing by the sink, rinsing coffee grounds from the filter. The smell of dark roast hung in the air, rich and bitter, almost mocking. I heard the mail slot click open, followed by the soft slap of envelopes hitting the floor. There it was, a white envelope with the law firm's logo. Heavy and official, my name typed neatly beside David's. My fingers trembled as I tore it open. The words inside swam before my eyes. They weren't asking anymore. They were ordering. The in-laws had filed a claim to repossess the house within 30 days. 30 days. After 3 years of memories, the walls we painted, the nights we cried into each other's arms, the quiet mornings when sunlight slid across the living room floor. It all came down to 30 days. I folded the letter and set it on the counter. The house felt different then, smaller, somehow, like the walls knew they weren't mine anymore. David came downstairs, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. What's that? He asked. I handed him the notice, without saying a word. Watching his face change, confusion to disbelief to quiet shame, made my chest ache. He sat down heavily at the table, elbows on his knees, head bowed. I didn't think they'd actually do it, he whispered. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of paperwork and phone calls. Celia guided me through every step. The affidavits, the counterclaims, the careful collection of evidence that showed the so-called gift had been a manipulation. I kept every text, every note, every voicemail. Elaine's voice messages played over and over in my head, her honey-sweet tone dripping with control. You're welcome, dear. Just remember, we did this for you. You owe us a little loyalty, don't you think? Family takes care of family. Each word was another chain I hadn't realized I was wearing. At night, I'd sit by the window in the living room, listening to the soft hum of passing cars. The mortgage papers lay on the coffee table beside me, their crisp edges glowing faintly in the lamplight. I traced the lines of David's signature, his careful, earnest handwriting, and wondered when he stopped being my partner and started being their pawn. The first hearing came faster than I expected. The courtroom smelled of old paper and disinfectant, its air cold and stale. Elaine sat 2 rows ahead of me, wearing a neat navy coat and pearls that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She looked calm, too calm, like someone who believed she'd already won. When she turned and met my gaze, she smiled. It wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile that said, "You should have stayed quiet." I looked back down at my hands, clasped tightly in my lap. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips. Celia leaned over and whispered, "Stay composed. They want you to look emotional, unstable. Don't give them that satisfaction." So I didn't. When Elaine took the stand, she spoke smoothly, her words dripping with practiced concern. "We only wanted to help them," she said. "But Anna has always been difficult. She refuses to show gratitude. She's turned David against his own family." Every sentence was a needle. I sat still, expression neutral, while she painted me as ungrateful and vindictive. But when it was Celia's turn, her calm precision sliced through Elaine's performance like a blade. "Mrs. Caldwell," Celia began, voice steady, "can you explain why, if this was truly a gift, the agreement includes a clause about property repossession?" Elaine hesitated. "It's standard language." Celia raised an eyebrow. "In family gifts." The courtroom went quiet. Elaine's fingers twitched against the edge of her purse. Then, Celia produced a printout, the text message I'd found weeks earlier. She handed it to the judge. "Your Honor, this message, sent by the claimant herself, describes the payment as, quote, a gift with no strings attached. This directly contradicts her claim of ownership." For the first time, Elaine's composure faltered. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes flicking toward me, sharp and cold. But I didn't look away. The hearing ended with the judge postponing any decision. We were to return in 2 weeks with more documentation. 2 weeks. It felt both like a lifetime and a blink. That night, David and I sat in silence again, not angry silence this time, but tired, the kind of silence that comes after too much has been said and not enough heard. He finally spoke. "They're not going to stop, are they?" I shook my head. "No, they want power, not peace." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time we stop asking for peace." It was the first time I'd seen something defiant in him since the beginning. The next 2 weeks were a blur of late nights and restless mornings. I gathered everything, receipts, email threads, even old family photos that showed us celebrating in the house after the mortgage was paid, proof that we'd believed it was ours. Celia submitted the files with quiet confidence. "This isn't just about legality anymore," she said. "It's about pattern. The court needs to see that they used generosity as a weapon." Her words lingered in my mind long after I left her office. Generosity as a weapon. How many times in my life had I accepted something with gratitude, not realizing it came with invisible strings? The final hearing came on a bright morning in April. The sky outside was impossibly blue, the kind of color that almost mocked you for feeling small. I wore a simple gray dress and tied my hair back, my palms damp despite the chill in the air. Elaine and her husband sat across the aisle. Their attorney spoke first, arguing that the family trust had been misused and that their payment gave them rightful claim to the property. Then Celia stood. Her voice was calm but firm. "This isn't a matter of ownership, it's a matter of intent." The defendants were led to believe this was a gift, as clearly evidenced in writing and conduct. The plaintiffs are now attempting to weaponize their generosity after coercing one spouse and excluding the other. That is not assistance, that is manipulation. I felt my throat tighten. When the judge asked for final remarks, I stood. I hadn't planned to speak, but something in me wouldn't stay quiet anymore. "Your Honor," I said softly, "I never wanted a fight. I just wanted a home, a place that felt safe. But safety isn't just walls and roofs, it's trust. And once that's broken, the house stops feeling like home." For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. Even Elaine didn't look at me. When the ruling came 2 weeks later, I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. The letter arrived just like the first plane, white, heavy. The court had ruled in our favor. The trust was deemed invalid. The house was ours. I set the letter down on the table beside me and stared out at the yard. The magnolia tree we planted 2 years ago had begun to bloom again. Soft white petals falling like quiet forgiveness. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. Inside, David was on the phone with his parents. His voice was low, tired, resigned. When he hung up, he looked at me and said simply, "They're cutting us off." I nodded. "Maybe that's for the best." He sat beside me, and for the first time in a long while, the silence between us felt peaceful. We didn't win because we beat them. We won because we finally stopped living under their shadow. The victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like the quiet after a long, brutal storm when the thunder stops but the sky still trembles. 4 days after the verdict, the house seemed to hum with a strange kind of stillness. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching the walls as if reassuring myself that they were really mine again. No papers, no signatures, no hidden clauses or whispered conditions, just ours. But peace, I learned, doesn't come free. It demands its own kind of reckoning. News of the court's decision spread quickly through the town. David's parents had always been respected pillars of their community, donors to charities, regulars at every social gathering that mattered. Their fall from grace wasn't loud, but it was visible. People whispered at the country club. Invitations stopped arriving. The family's business associates began to pull away, careful not to be caught in the shadow of scandal. Elaine hated that more than anything. Not the money, not the court loss, but the whispers. One evening, I saw her name flash across my phone. I stared at it for a long time before answering. Her voice was cold, clipped. "You've made a fool of this family." I said nothing. "You think you've won. You've poisoned my son against us, destroyed decades of reputation." I took a slow breath. "I didn't destroy anything, Elaine. I just stopped pretending." For a moment, there was silence on the line. A silence sharp enough to cut through. Then she hung up. That was the last time she ever called. David withdrew for a while after that. He'd lost something too, not just the family connection, but the illusion that had held him together. For years, he'd balanced between loyalty and love, never realizing how much of himself he'd given away in the process. Some nights, I'd find him sitting in the backyard, staring up at the dark sky. The glow from the porch light softened the edges of his face. "I keep thinking about what they'll say," he admitted one night, "at church, at the firm. It's all built on their name." I sat beside him, hands folded in my lap. "Then maybe it's time you build something on yours." He didn't answer, but I saw the thought take root behind his eyes. Over the next few months, the quiet transformation began. David resigned from his father's company, an act that sent ripples through their entire circle. He opened his own consulting firm, small at first, built on the same discipline his father had taught him, but free from the old games. I started writing again. For years, I'd put my stories on hold, too consumed with managing the house, smoothing over family friction, and surviving the emotional politics that came with their generosity. Now, I filled notebooks with memories, fragments of truth dressed as fiction, stories of invisible battles fought behind smiling faces. Celia, ever pragmatic, suggested I publish them one day. "People need to know how control hides behind kindness," she said, "and how quiet rebellion can be a kind of power." Her words stayed with me. Summer arrived slowly that year. The magnolia tree outside bloomed wide and heavy, its branches dipping low with the weight of white petals. We hosted a small gathering, just a few friends, nothing extravagant, no caterers, no photographers, no forced smiles, just laughter, food, and the sound of a guitar somewhere in the background at one point. David leaned toward me and said, "It feels different this time." I smiled. "Because it's real." He nodded, eyes tracing the horizon. "You know," he said, "I thought losing them would break me, but maybe it just freed me." The in-laws moved out of town soon after. Their house, once the setting for grand dinners and family announcements, was sold quietly, without ceremony. I heard from someone that Elaine had started volunteering at a local charity in another state. Maybe guilt, maybe pride, maybe just distance. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a strange, detached pity. People like her, I realized, didn't know how to love without ownership. They only understood affection as a transaction. And when you stopped playing by those rules, you stopped existing to them. That was fine by me. Months passed. The lawsuit faded into memory, just another story whispered about in quiet corners. But its shadow left lessons, small, steady truths that I carried with me every day. I learned that power isn't in control. It's in the ability to walk away. That peace isn't granted. It's built, piece by piece, from the ruins of what once controlled you. And that sometimes, to save what's yours, you have to lose what was never meant to belong to you. One afternoon, as autumn crept back into the air, David came home holding a thin envelope. "It's from the bank," he said, smiling faintly. Inside was the final confirmation. The mortgage was officially transferred under our names alone. No ties, no shared trust, no interference. He handed me the paper. It's all ours now. Completely. I looked at him for a long moment, then at the document. The paper felt light, impossibly light for what it represented. I think, I said softly, it always was. We just didn't believe it. He laughed quietly. And the sound filled the room. The same house that had once held fear and silence now echoed with something new. Freedom. That night, we sat on the porch again, the air cool and crisp. The world felt still, not in the hollow way it once did, but with a deep, contented quiet. David reached for my hand. You ever think about what's next? I thought about it, about rebuilding, about writing again, about the chapters still unwritten. Yeah, I said, but for the first time, I don't feel like I have to rush to find out. He smiled. That's a first. Guess, we're both learning, I said, squeezing his hand. The wind carried the faint scent of magnolia blossoms from the yard. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and laughter drifted from a nearby house. Life, messy, ordinary, and beautiful, kept moving, and in that moment, I realized something simple but profound. The story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning or proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming the quiet, the space where your voice finally sounds like your own. The world didn't need to know our victory. The papers didn't have to print it. The neighbors didn't have to gossip about it. Because the truest kind of justice doesn't shout, it breathes, it lives, it continues. It took months before I realized how quiet peace could sound at first. I didn't recognize it. The absence of arguments, the lack of tense dinners or cautious phone calls, it all felt unnatural. I'd lived for so long under the subtle hum of obligation that silence felt like guilt. I used to wake up expecting another email from Elaine, another request wrapped in polite words that carried invisible strings, but none came. Instead, there were mornings filled with light, the soft golden kind that drifted across our bedroom curtains. For the first time in years, I wasn't performing. I wasn't rehearsing answers in my head before every family gathering, or wondering if my tone sounded grateful enough. I was just living. I started tending the garden again, the one Elaine had once called a waste of time because it didn't add to the house's value. The soil was tough and stubborn, but each morning I went out, gloved hands deep in the dirt, feeling the earth give a little more. There was something healing about it, something wordless. Maybe because the ground didn't care about conditions, you give it what it needs, and it gives something back. No negotiations, no hidden terms. David would join me sometimes after work, setting down 2 cups of tea on the porch. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. There was a peace in shared silence, the kind that only exists between people who've been through fire and survived it together. But healing, I learned, doesn't always arrive gently. There were still moments when I caught him staring out the window, phone in hand, thumb hovering over his mother's number. Sometimes he'd dial half the digits, then stop. I just keep thinking, he said one night, what if I'd handled it differently? What if we could have found a middle ground? I turned to him, my voice steady. You can't make peace with someone who only negotiates and control. He nodded, but the ache didn't vanish. Guilt, I realized, lingers longest in those who tried to love the hardest. One day, a letter arrived. It was from Elaine. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of script that tries to hide emotion behind perfect lines. She wrote about moving to another city, about how quiet the days had become, about how David's father rarely spoke anymore. She didn't apologize, not really, but between the sentences, I could read the shape of regret. At the end, she wrote, I still believe I was protecting my family, but maybe I mistook control for care. I read that line 3 times. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was honesty, and that, to me, meant more than any apology could. I didn't reply right away. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a box at the back of my desk drawer, the same one that once held the deed to our house. Sometimes, healing doesn't mean reopening old doors. It just means closing them gently. Life moved on in quiet, beautiful ways. David's firm grew, slowly but steadily. He hired people who shared his values, integrity over ambition, service over status. Clients respected that. As for me, my writing found its own audience. I began publishing essays online, small reflections about boundaries, and what it means to choose peace over permission. One of those essays went viral, a piece called The Price of a Gift. I had written it late one night, sitting by the window while the rain tapped softly against the glass. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't revengeful. It was honest. I wrote about how love given with strings isn't love, it's leverage. How generosity used as a weapon leaves invisible bruises, and how learning to say no can sometimes save your soul. The responses poured in from women all over the world, strangers who shared their own stories of control. Dressed as kindness, mothers, daughters, wives. One woman wrote, "Your story gave me courage to move out of my in-laws' house. I finally feel like I can breathe again." Reading that, I cried, not from sadness, but from recognition, the deep kind that says, "You're not alone anymore." Months later, I stood in front of a small community writing group, reading that essay aloud. The air was thick with empathy, that quiet stillness that fills a room when everyone recognizes a piece of themselves in someone else's story. When I finished, an older woman came up to me. She touched my arm gently and said, "You didn't just save your home, dear. You reclaimed your name." Her words stayed with me, because she was right. It was never about the house. It was about identity. The house was just the stage. The real story was about learning to stand in my own light without asking anyone's permission to do so. Now, sometimes when I walk through the hallway, I run my fingers along the wall. I think about all the moments that happened within these rooms, the laughter, the shouting, the tears, the whispered doubts at 2 a.m., and then I think about how every wall still stands, still holds, still protects, not because someone paid for it, but because we fought for it, together. Together. Last week, I planted a magnolia sapling in the yard, a new one, beside the old tree. David smiled when he saw it. "Starting over again?" he asked. "Not starting over," I said. "Just continuing the story?" He nodded, slipping an arm around my shoulders as we watched the wind catch its leaves. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stepped outside, barefoot, the cool earth grounding me. The air smelled faintly of rain and soil. The new magnolia swayed in the breeze, fragile but rooted. And in that quiet darkness, I whispered a small thank you. To myself. To the lessons. To the storm that broke me open enough to grow. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't loud. They're found in the smallest, simplest moments. A cup of tea in the morning light, laughter echoing through your own walls, the feeling of safety without permission. That's what freedom looks like. Not grand, not cinematic, just quiet, honest, earned. And now, whenever someone asks me about that time when my in-laws paid off our mortgage and tried to take everything back, I tell them this: they didn't repossess my house. They just taught me what it means to own my life.